I'm Anna from NHCSR. I'm an entomologist. Anybody who knows me knows I get a little salty about honeybees. This might come as a shock. Some of it is personal, as a pest management specialist who has spent a lot of her time trying to recruit students into a pest management program. It can be hard when the youth are so horny for bees. They much more rather study beneficial insects than pests. That makes sense. Some of it is more principled. Well, the general public views honeybees as kind of the poster children for conservation. Many entomologists view them as kind of like chickens of the insect world. They're an agricultural commodity, and they can sometimes cause more ecological problems than they solve. I hate honeybees. They're obviously really important for a lot of reasons, for commercial reasons, for cultural reasons. There's not a lot of things much more steeped in human culture than raising honeybees. However, I do kind of bristle the massive focus on one very successful non-native species that overshadows thousands of native species that are also facing habitat loss. In general, entomologists are basically just really stoked whenever they see more research or more emphasis put on stuff that benefits all wildlife. And a lot of the conservation efforts we've seen that are targeting honeybees also benefit wild bee species. Most of us kind of just sit on our hands and resist the urge to say, well, actually, whenever there's misinformation put out about honeybees, we're just stoked to hear the public talking about insects in general. Then there's these circumstances where folks are promoting things that might be flooding a fragile ecosystem with what amounts to livestock, outcompeting, maybe starving, maybe infecting wild animals that actually keep the ecosystem healthy. So let's talk about it, right? I am reaching out to people who know much more about this to give me some advice with how to talk to the public about bees, about pollinators, and it's absolutely lovely. I'm learning a lot about conservation, and I'm learning a lot about all the work that goes into describing these bee species. I mean, granted, anytime you look up how many species of whatever there are and such, you kind of wonder, like, where does that work come from? It's like somebody's out there looking for them and characterizing them and describing them. And so I hope you appreciate my conversation with Tracy Zarrillo. We talk about her work studying wild bee species in Connecticut.
My name is Tracy Zarrillo. I work at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station in New Haven, Connecticut. I've worked there since 1992, and I have been studying wild bees now since about 2010. So it's going on 16 years. Prior to working with bees, I did a lot of work on organic farms, trying to find ways to help farmers deal with their pests. Worked on Colorado potato beetle a little bit, pepper maggots, squash bugs. But I finally have found my insect that I love. So I should say insects, because there's more than one species. Of course, there's more than one species of bee. In Connecticut, we now have about 395 species of bees. That's our latest tally. We added a bunch of species last year that were caught in our state for the first time. We suspect that there's probably more species hidden just in habitats that people normally don't go into. So we're going to make a concerted effort this year to go out and look for some of these rare bee species.
Well, that actually leads to my first question for you, because you have worked with grower groups, you've worked with commercial farmers, you've worked with the public writ large, and I want to know, what do you mean when you say bee, and what is like the hardest way to get through to any of these people you're talking to about like what's a bee versus other groups?
I think I get a lot of confusion when I tell people that I study bees. They automatically think that I study honeybees, which I don't. I really don't know a whole lot about honeybees. Some other people at the agricultural station that do work with honeybees. We have an inspector who goes out and inspects the hives, for farmers and people who are raising bees. I normally explain that wild bees are like the vegetarian cousins of wasps. That's another source of confusion too, is that when I say I study bees, especially ground nesting bees, a lot of people start talking about these bees that come out of the ground when they mow their lawn in the summer, or they happen to step over a nest or something, and then 100 come out and they get stung. So those are yellow jackets. The solitary bees that I work with, the ground nesting bees, are not social, so they don't have a huge nest to defend. They don't bother you. They're not aggressive at all. They won't chase you. They're more interested in going out and collecting pollen and nectar. So
Well, in that sense, it does make sense to say vegetarian cousin.
yeah. So bees have evolved from wasps. They have evolved to be able to use plants for food. Wasps are mostly predators. So they'll go out and they'll catch their prey and bring their prey back to their nest. Whereas bees go out and they collect pollen and nectar and they bring that back for their larvae to eat.
I think as an entomologist, I get caught up in talking about relatedness, right? So we're always talking about different groups based on their evolution and how they're related and like taxonomic structure. But I think for most people, they're more interested in categorizing them where I would say maybe two questions, which is like, where can you find them? And number two, what can you do to support them? Right? So like they kind of get categorized according to that. So you and I were talking a little bit about ground nesting bees versus like stem nesting. Is it too reductive to refer to bee groups based on where you find them?
So about 70% of our bee species in the state nest in the ground. And then the other 30% are what we call cavity nesters. And they'll nest not only in stems, but in old beetle holes in wood. We have a couple of wood nesting bee species. One of our more interesting cavity nesting bees that we haven't seen in a long time, and it's probably still here, they're just really super hard to find because they actually nest in the cavity of snail shells of a particular species of snail. So we have to find the snail in order to find the bee. Yeah, it is, isn't it?
All right, so what about what you can grow to support them? Because I know a lot of your work has looked at generalist versus specialist. Like, how do you communicate that?
Realizing that there are more than one species, that they all have different food requirements. So it's not like you could lump all birds into one category, and say birds need this. There's generalist bees which will eat just about anything pollen-wise, and then there are the specialist bees who can only feed their larvae a particular kind of pollen, whether it's from a particular family, a particular genus of plants. Some are even more specialized than that and will only use a specific species of plant. So it gets pretty crazy. So when people are thinking about what and who they want to plant for, I think they should figure out who they want to plant for, because there's different plants for different bees. Like people want to plant meadows, and then they want to plant flowers, in their gardens that will bloom, from June until the end of the year. But a lot of the species that we have will start to emerge in late March if it's warm enough, and April. There's no meadows blooming at that time of year. So they will get their forage from different types of shrubs and trees. Willows are great if people, have the room to put a little willow, maybe a little pussy willow in your yard. Red buds also are really good, and they're really pretty. Later on in the season, there's plants like penstemon and golden alexanders, which are also good early plants that bloom around June, late May, going into summer. There's monarda. Sunflowers. Sunflowers are great. There's lots of sunflower specialists. And then as you move into fall, goldenrod and asters like Symphotrichum are just powerhouses for the end of the year. Yeah, you really can't beat those two. And different goldenrod starts blooming at various times of the year. So there's like an early one, I think it's Solidago juncea, that starts blooming, I think, in July. You can get a whole like 3/4 season's worth with goldenrod, and it's such a great plant.
I think it's really nice to find out that a bunch of plants that are in our landscape that we grow because we love them are also doing duty. It's not like there's these really unique species, like a little smorgasbord.
Rhododendron is great for early season bees too.
Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of these, plants and shrubs people may already have in their yards and gardens already.
I kind of wanted your advice about too was obviously we have a lot of resources out there that describe the kinds of species that you might find in your backyard. I was reading through the surveys that you've done in Connecticut, and it's just amazing the amount of diversity that you can have in our backyards. I'm curious about what's missing. Like, what do people need to know more about, especially when it comes to thinking about the plants that we grow as far as like being habitat, right? Like we talked about having a nice smorgasbord of flowering plants so they can have pollen to provision their nests, but we're also thinking about these plants as like places where they live. Do you have any advice for people there?
Try not to be as neat. If you could leave some places in your yard for bees to nest. They do like to nest in bare grounds, sloping areas. They will also nest in places like under leaves or under grass tussocks. People always say that bees nest in bare ground, but are those just the nests that we see? You know what I mean? So I think that there might be a bias.
Like the best rule of thumb is just like places that are undisturbed.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we find out that doing nothing is sometimes the best solution to our
Exactly.
problem.
Yes. Yeah.
Something else I'm really curious about is that it publicly, like around libraries and things like that, I see a lot of quote unquote pollinator gardens. And I think part of the reason that they're putting those out there is to just educate people about like, hey, here's all the plants that you might already have in your yard, you might do da. But they're like mulched with like really heavy duty wood chips. What is your thought about that?
So the flowers are supporting the bees. The wood chips, they do not like to nest in wood chips or pebbles. But bees don't always necessarily nest where they forage. So even if there's wood chips, if people want to put wood chips in their yard, as long as there's other places in their yard to nest, it's good habitat.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense to kind of think about what you're doing in your yard that's beautiful looking and could be a good place to forage versus wild places that are either in your yard or in your neighborhood where they're actually living. I think that's kind of a neat way to think about it.
Some species will nest near where they forage, like squash bees will tend to nest in a squash field, not necessarily. So if these gardens are not having, bare soil by their flowers, I'm sure that there's some type of soil around the library property where they might be nesting.
All right. Well, speaking of gardens, I want to hear more about the project you've been doing with bumblebees and rare species of bumblebees. Do you want to tell me about that?
I just got a grant this year to go out and look for rare bees, including our yellow-banded bumblebee, Bombus terricola. And so that species was pretty much throughout the state, and then it kind of tanked, and we stopped seeing it, which was really weird, in the early 2000s. And then all of a sudden in 2018, it started to show up again in Litchfield County. Since it was first rediscovered in 2018, we've been seeing more populations of it kind of spread from a central hub. We're going to look to see how related the bees are that we're finding there. Look to see if they're related to populations that are up in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire and Vermont. What we're seeing with that particular species is that it seems to be moving to higher elevation and not just moving more north. Yeah.
What do you think's going on there?
Climate change, its range is shifting. So it is becoming more northern, but they tend to be doing better in places with higher elevation.
Interesting. And do you think that has anything to do with the host species or
No,
um
they're a generalist
they're
feeder.
generalists, yeah.
Yeah, all bumblebees are generalists. Sometimes they have a preference for flowers, but that just is dictated by their tongue length. So bees with super long tongues like to use flowers with super long corollas, and then other bees with super short tongues like to use flowers with the shorter structure. This is kind of interesting and funny. Bees with the short tongues will sometimes cheat to get into the flowers with the long corollas. They're called nectar robbers, and they'll go in and they'll make a little hole at the base of the tube, and then stick their tongue in through the hole instead of going in from the top of the flower and sticking it all the way down in. They just make a hole in the side and just
Cheers.
yeah.
Oh, it's so cute. Well, can you tell me about the difference between rare and general species?
Yeah, so we have had 16 species of bumblebee documented here in our state. We really just see about 5 species very commonly now, which would be your common bumblebee Bombus impatiens, the confusing bumblebee Bombus perplexus, the spotted bumblebee Bombus bimaculatus, versicollis, and vagans. There's other species of bumblebees that you'll see but not as often. There's Sanderson's bumblebee, which you tend to find near forest edges, and it seems to like more of a pristine habitat. You're not likely to find it in your backyard garden for whatever reason. There's Bombus fervidus, which is declining. People think that it's declining, and it very well may be, but it's a species that likes open habitat, open fields, and because a lot of our fields are growing up into forests, we're seeing its habitat being replaced. But it is still around. We still find it localized, in various places. There's the rusty patch bumblebee that used to be common in Connecticut, but the last one was seen 1997, I think it was 1997. Yeah, and it has lost a lot of its range across the U.S. Right now, there's remnant populations that are in the Midwest and in Appalachian Mountains. Fish and Wildlife are talking about doing a reintroduction possibly, so that would be pretty cool.
That's very interesting. Tell me more about reintroductions of rare species like this. Like,
See, I don't really
how do people
know.
decide to do? This actually does lead into what I need a lot of advice about, which is talking about purposeful introductions of insects into landscapes. I think about them in like 3 different groups, like what you're talking about, which is like, we've seen declines in this species. We're thinking about reintroducing them. Like, oh, we've thought through this and we think it's worth using our resource to reintroduce a species that's declining. But that's really different from what people will do often with Bombus impatiens, which is to purchase quads of these for pollination services in their orchards. So like having more of a bee that is already very abundant in the landscape, but like doing a pulse of it in the landscape. Like, do you have any thoughts about how that impacts native species of bees, bumblebee, even Bombus impatiens?
There has been research out saying that there is pathogen spillover from these managed bumblebees. There is that danger. I know people have used them in greenhouses and for agriculture. I don't know if people know that in order to do any releases, such as releasing bumblebees, you are really supposed to get a permit from DEEP in order to do that. And then you would have to say why you're doing it and what your hopeful outcome would be, and then they would deem whether or not they think that
the risk is worth
it. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, that makes sense. Something else, and I am just becoming aware of this, is the reason I'm having such a hard time talking about this is it's like people are wanting to do something very good, right? And the idea of purchasing osmia bees, which is a completely different group of bees, but that is a wild bee species. Can you tell me more about osmia?
The species that are being sold, as far as I know, are either Osmia lignaria. So there's two subspecies. There's one that's on the East Coast and one that's on the West Coast. And then there are some non-native species of mason bees that were brought in for agriculture, or one was actually brought in intentionally. The other one just kind of hooked a ride and came along as well too. They both seem to be displacing our native bees. There is a bunch of research coming out showing that as the populations of these exotic bees are going up, the populations of our native bees are going down. It could be competition, could be disease.
Those osmia species, to the average person, even if they're like a really well-trained amateur entomologist, like they probably look pretty similar, but they're not related because they're coming from different places in the country. Is that kind of what you're saying?
People may be able to tell them apart in the field. Most of our native osmia are blue. There's only a few species that are black, and they're pretty rare. The exotics are more of a metallic black, and their hair is really red, rufous, not like red like a stop sign, but more like a burnt orange kind of a color. Yeah.
I noticed that you have a resource on how to use iNaturalist for some of these to make sure to get as many different pictures of different angles of the bee if you're using iNaturalist to help you identify species. So that's really helpful. Now, I know that Connecticut has some rules about introductions of all these species. Do you know about other New England states? Like, is this something that people are talking about, having more rules about releases, or is this just unique to Connecticut?
No, I'm hearing from other states that as this research is pouring in now about the effects of these masons on our native masons, I think that people in other states are also starting to pay attention. I don't know that they have the regulations that we do with permitting, but that may be something that's coming down the pike.
That's very interesting. So how do you communicate this? Like when you find out that somebody is purposefully releasing a species like this because they're trying to do something good in their neighborhood, like what's your first approach to communicating what they should do or what they shouldn't do?
I'll ask whether or not they know that they are supposed to get a permit to release them in the state. Then I'll ask them why that they bought them, to figure out, do they think that they're having a pollination deficit in their garden? If they're buying mason bees to help pollinate their tomatoes or squash later on in the year, that's not going to happen because these are very early season bees. So unless you have early fruit trees or something like that you need help with pollination, Osmia lignaria is not going to be the one to purchase.
If you find out, oh, I'm releasing them because I'm trying to save the bees, right? I wonder if there are other things that are really easy for people to do in their backyard that give them something to do, which, you can see why I'm so uncomfortable with this. It's just to say, like, my attitude about it is like, these bees live in your backyard. The best thing you can do is nothing, right? But there's a lot of people who, like, they want to learn something new, or they want to give their kids an experience, or they want to see visually that they're making an impact. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for, like, especially like amateur starting out, what are the best places to look for bees? Like if you're looking for, like, we talked about some things in the landscape. Are there any like stem nesting bees that you can look for?
I think the stem nesting projects are pretty cool. And it's just using natural materials. If you have any brambles in your yard, or even if you have stems that you cut back, like say the previous year, so they were open, with a hole for bees to come nest in them last summer, that then they'll be in there now, and you can go in and you could like slice the stem open and you might find little carpenter bees inside. Not what people know about carpenter bees. You think about the big ones, that come and they do damage to your property, and they kind of seem intimidating because they're very curious, and they come and they fly right in front of your face, and they just kind of hover and look at you. Small carpenter bees are actually a navy blue color, and they're really, really cute. And they are good pollinators of raspberries. So what people could do, I'd say just go into your yard and slow down and just look to see what you have already, before you want to go out and buy things. You don't need to buy things in order to help save bees. There's just a lot that you can do in your own yard by just, like we say, just maybe not keep things so tidy so that they might have a place to nest. If you have a lawn that's covering your entire yard, then they're not going to have a place to nest there.
Speaking of raspberries, speaking of some of the perennials that like have these like kind of woody stems, like is there a difference if you cut them way back versus cutting them a little bit longer? Like, do you have a rule of thumb about how much length to leave behind if you're hoping to find stem nesting bees in your yard?
So the general recommendation is to leave between 12 inches and 18 inches of stubble. And I did an experiment last year where the plants that I'm doing another experiment with, I have 3 species of plants growing, which is a project looking for specialist bees and seeing how long it takes for the specialist bee to actually find its host plant. As another aspect of it, last year I went in and cut this 20 stems in each place. One is 12 inches and the other is 18 inches. And I want to see if there's a difference, if they tend to nest more in the 12 inches or in the 18 inches, if they tend to nest more in one species of flower versus the other. There's a lot of really cool research that could be done, to see what types of flowers that these bees are using for a nesting habitat. And then if people wanted, they could plant those flowers in their yard instead of going out and buying bee hotels. You could just plant some heliopsis, cut it back in the fall or in the spring of the following year, and then you'll have bees coming in to nest that year, and then you'll just have a cycle of just providing habitat instead of buying habitat.
I love it. That's your music to my ears. Is there any time of year that they would be looking for these bees to be emerging? So like, say you planted these plants, they're perennial, so like they're not really producing the woody stems until the end of the year. You're cutting them back, you're 12 to 18 inches, and stay tuned to see if it makes a difference from your research. And then they're finding those and they're provisioning them, like they're maybe nesting in there themselves over winter, and they're emerging in the spring. Like, would that be the best time of year, like March, April, May, to start seeing them emerge? Or what's your advice for like the best viewing times?
Yeah, for the small carpenter bees, I would say April. They start to come out early. They have multiple generations through the year, so they will continually use the nests throughout the year. There's other species of cavity nesting bees that will use other types of plants that might come out later on in the summer. There's like megachilids that'll come out like mid-July. There's a specialist bee that uses squash pollen. So a lot of people plant squash in their yard. They may not know that they are providing forage for the squash bee. There's a couple of bee species that use ground cherry. So if people are planting ground cherry in their vegetable gardens, they are also supporting a species of plaster bee and a species of sweat bee that can only use that kind of pollen.
Oh, that's exciting. I love ground cherry, but I know
I do.
people don't like to plant it because they think it's too weedy. But now I have a reason to say you have a whole patch of your yard that is now taken over by ground cherry.
Yes. And there is a kleptoparasitic bee that its host is the bee that uses the ground cherry. So if you're planting ground cherry, you're not only supporting the specialist bees, you're also supporting the kleptoparasitic bee that is parasitizing those bees. So you're supporting 3 bee species.
Ooh, that sounds pretty good. A lot of life going on over there,
Yeah.
and you get the ground cherries year after year. So
Yes. Yeah.
even better. Well, I feel a lot better about this osmia situation because I know it's something that people do, and like they know it's good, and then you have to go, well, actually, it's kind of complicated, but here's all these other things that you can do that are really fun. So it's
Yeah. Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah. Exactly.
Cool.
Exactly.